While ethical relativism and subjectivism do have their appeal, they do come with a variety of problems. One problem is that relativism, somewhat ironically, undermines one of the factors that are used to give it appeal, specifically the tolerance argument. Now, if morality is simply relative to each culture, then cultures that lack a principle of tolerance obviously have no obligation to be tolerant. As such, relativists provide no basis for criticizing those who are intolerant, and of course, cannot rationally criticize anyone advocating what they regard as terrible principles. And so one of the ironies is that although people claim that ethical relativism is appealing because it grounds tolerance, obviously enough, if morality is relative to culture, cultures that lack tolerance are under no obligation to accept that, because that would be based on an assumption of objective ethics as opposed to relativism. The second problem, relativism precludes cross-cultural criticism. And the problem is this. If valid criticism assumes an objective or at least impartial standard, relativists cannot morally criticize anyone outside of their culture because, again, whatever is correct is set by the culture, and so if another culture does something different, the only thing they can say is, well, we don't do that, but I guess they do. We can't claim that they are wrong. So if a culture practices, say, racism, oppression, genocide, and they accept that, those would be equally good as the cultural view that there should be racial equality, or no genocide, or no oppression. And so there's no way to criticize across cultures. Another problem is there are what appear to be some disturbing consequences. One disturbing consequence is that reformers would always be morally wrong if they're trying to change the culture, because they're going against cultural standards. Now, of course, if they change the standards, and the standards are now the majority view, then they would thus suddenly be right. But anyone who tries to reform a culture clearly would be acting wrongly, because what the culture accepts is right, which seems problematic. Another problem is, of course, is that if we base the culture on, say, majority acceptance, or whoever is in power, that would seem to entail that whoever is the majority, or at least those who are in power to set the culture, are always right, and those who might disagree would always be wrong, which seems problematic. Now, another problem, which leads to other problems, is the problem of actually defining a culture. The notion of a culture is rather difficult to define. One way to sort of illustrate this is considering the following sort of scenario. If you take a typical culture, say the United States, there will be conflicting moralities based on a person's membership within subcultures. For example, suppose you have someone who's an American who's Catholic. Well, according to American culture, birth control is acceptable. But according to Catholicism, birth control is not. And hence they would have a conflict between their cultures. Now, the problem then is, how do we decide which culture is the one to go with? Take the example of the American Catholic. Do they go with the American culture? The Catholic culture? And since the culture determines the morality, it's rather important to know which culture is the one that determines it. And so it's rather difficult to define this, which leads to a problem, because we need a clear culture to determine what's morally right, based on relativism, but alas, we do not have this. Which leads to our next problem, which is this. If we have no principled way of defining a culture, then anyone presumably could form a culture of one. Now this can occur, for real, so to speak. You could have a culture that exists, but then for whatever reason, it perishes down to one member. Now, if the culture was a culture with all those members, it would seem that the culture would still remain, as long as the member survives. And if that's acceptable, then a person could create their own culture and be a culture of one, which of course would end up taking relativism and collapsing it into subjectivism, because each person could have their own culture. Now, the problem there is that subjectivism seems to collapse into our old friend moral nihilism. Now, why does this occur? Well, morality is a matter, on this view, in the case of subjectivism, of what appears to be taste. Whatever you accept is correct because you accept it. Whatever you reject because you reject it. Now, there's no basis for resolving disputes here, because there won't be a common ground. And this rather contradicts the notion that morality is supposed to assist us in resolving our conflicts. And the problem is, in terms of getting to nihilism, is that if morality is simply what an individual accepts, in effect there is no morality. To use the obvious analogy, imagine if people could just make their own laws subjectively. They could decide what is illegal or legal for themselves. And that would in effect be legal nihilism. There would be no law. Similarly for ethics. If everyone sort of chooses their own ethics, in effect there is no ethics, or so it could be claimed. Finally, there is a criticism of the original argument for ethical relativism. Now, in the case of the diversity thesis, it could be contended that although cultures vary in morality, they do share very similar moral principles. Principles against, killing people, taking their stuff, lying, etc. Now, many of the examples that are used to try to show that cultures are radically different in morality, they always are from these tiny, often dying cultures, which would suggest that they actually have things wrong, which is why the culture is, collapsing, perhaps. Or, of course, that can be countered as well. Now, in regards to the dependency thesis, that could also be accounted for. While cultures seem to vary in their application, there could actually be, a shared core of objective morality. For example, given at Herodotus, where the Greeks and the Kalate are, talking about how they treat their dead. Now, they may disagree in terms of the particulars. For example, the Greeks, say, burning their dead or burying their dead, and the Kalate consuming their dead, but they both agree that the dead should be treated with respect. And so there could be an objective moral principle, the dead are to be treated with respect, that gets manifested in different ways. And so we can reconcile the apparent diversity with actual objective morality. And of course, the mere fact that people have differing views doesn't mean there's no objective fact. To use an obvious example, if you have a group of people in a class trying to solve a difficult math problem, and they get different answers, one wouldn't say, well, I guess there's no objective answer. The obvious conclusion would be, well, a lot of people have got it wrong. There can only be one right answer, and maybe everyone's got it wrong in this class. And that brings us to the end of part 2, looking at moral theories.